I'm back at it with the old Washburn. Decided to start planing up some reinforcement strips and plates. This is some old spruce soundboard material. I got my bench hook here with a retaining lip that's maybe a little too thin for this job, so I'm holding the stock with a hand in front of the plane to steady it. I'll keep cutting until I get a continuous clean shaving. Then I know I've removed all the surface irregularities from the bandsaw. There, that's good enough. Because this surface is dished here right now, I've made a clamping caul that's got some tape on it, successive layers, to produce something of a concavity. It's about 12 thousandths in the center there. So I'm going to be pulling this up to just past flat, which I think is a good idea. Individual little blocks on here for each clamp so that we can get into kind of a radius situation on the inside as well. So it's important to have so many different clamps of differing lengths. In a situation like this, I really could use one that was like a ½ inch shorter. But we make do. People are often surprised to see me using a great big wide chisel when I'm doing this kind of pairing work. But when I'm using it bevel down like this, it's basically like a hand plane. Having that extra width kind of goes a long way to keeping things on track. It makes it less likely to dig in, because it's registering off a larger area of soundboard. The next part of the scheme involves supporting the area around the sound hole here. It's still dipping. This is the weak point in guitars with ladder bracing. In other words, the braces are straight across like railroad ties, as opposed to Martin-style X bracing, which crosses. We see this deforming as the guitar tries to fold inward on itself. The sound hole makes the area weak, and that's where it just naturally gets centered. Almost none of these ladder braced guitars were built with sound hole braces, which coincidentally is something you see in almost every single X brace design, and most classical guitar designs as well. So that's something. Not that there are a lot of people out there trying to build with ladder bracing these days, but if you are, maybe put these in. Or if someone is working on one, it's something to consider, you know. Spend an extra 20 minutes and save yourself some grief later on. I usually try and have them at an angle so they cross more grain, and I want them butted up tight against the braces on either side of the hole, so that folding force is being transferred, and this area becomes fairly rigid. I'm gluing this up with the same slightly curved caul to pull this just a little bit past flat and introduce a slight dome. I'm willing to bet that these are built with soundboards that were flat, perfectly flat at the factory. Maybe there was some slight doming to the braces, but by and large the upper bouts always seem to be pretty much dead flat. Having removed the fingerboard in the previous video, I'm just going to true up the surface a little bit with a flat sanding block here. The surface is kind of okay. It's sort of concave in cross-section, which is what I want. I'll mark a center line. I'm inlaying a couple of carbon fiber strips. They're square in cross-section, 6 millimeters a side, and I need to route straight channels for them to sit in there. Just a hair deeper than the strips are tall, so there's no chance they're going to remain proud of the surface when I glue them in. This is a jig that I tape and super glue to the neck. It's just a tray for my plunge router, and you can see I've also glued on a stop block at the appropriate location. I do this in a series of passes. I know they don't look centered, but it's an optical illusion. The dovetail isn't centered either. I'll square up the ends with a chisel and clean them up. This is a slightly stripy piece of ebony, but it's quarter sawn, which is rare to find these days. I think we're getting towards the end of ebony as a commercial timber. I don't mind ritualite and the other substitutes, you know, but this is period correct, and I'll use it while I have it. So planing ebony, it's just kind of a slow, steady process. Can't take a heavy cut, just sort of sneak up on it and adjust the plane frequently until you're getting just a little sliver without too much tear out. I'll plane up an edge true and perpendicular to one of the faces, so I have something I can work off for laying out the fret positions. This is a machinist rule with markings so close together you need a magnifier to see them, even with young eyes. I use an online fret calculator, as this is a weird scale. It's close to 24¼ inches, about 616 millimeters. So I'll just mark that up with a very fine drafting pen on a piece of tape that's been put onto the surface of the ebony. To cut fret slots, I use this blade set from Luthier's Mercantile International, not a sponsor, which I've had for a long time now. It consists of a couple of heavy-duty stifting plates and the 6-inch blade, which cuts a 23 thousandths kerf. That number, which is about like 0.6 millimeters, it's kind of standard in the industry, although it's not set in stone. You could use a blade that's slightly thinner or thicker. As the tang on fret wire is usually about 18 or 19 thousandths wide, there's always a bit of an air gap between the tang and the sides of the fret slot. You're really relying on the barbs of the fret to hold it in place. That's one of the reasons I like to use glue in the slot. It helps fill the gap. Some early T-shaped fret wire was barbless and relied on a friction fit between the tang and the slot, just like a bar fret. But that could be really difficult to control. There's a reason we use barbed T-shaped wire now. Setting the height of the saw blade takes some guesswork, as we need to leave an allowance for the fact that the surface is eventually going to be radiused and a bunch of the fretboard is going to be sanded away, removing a lot of slot depth at the edges. I find that on an average size board and using fret wire with a tang of about 60 thousandths height, I usually need to cut the slots about 100 thousandths deep. Here you can see my position marks, inked with a very thin pen, and how those just line up by eye with the slotting jig. There are, of course, ways to make positive stops, but in a case like this, I may never slot another board of this exact scale, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to produce a reusable template. Once again, the shakiness you see here is an amplification of the camera's internal efforts to negate the vibration caused by the table saw stand. It doesn't feel like this in daily life. I'm going to mark off the position of the 12th fret. This will aid in positioning the taper on the sides of the board. I've actually used the green tape to demark the edges of the board. It's just much easier to see this than a pencil line on this black ebony when you're trying to put it through a bandsaw. Replacing a fretboard on one of these old guitars, especially a bound board, is not always as simple as it may seem. The thing is, if I take measurements at the nut and the 12th fret and simply replicate that with straight lines, I'm going to end up with a neck that feels very weird, because the profile on this tapers towards the edge, and putting a simple rectangle on top means that you're going to have a very abrupt transition between the two here that isn't particularly comfortable to hold. In other words, we want to blend those two surfaces together into a kind of curve. Again, that would seem pretty simple, just make the neck slightly oversized, make sure there's enough thickness to the binding that I don't scrape through. The problem is, we're not dealing with straight lines. During the initial shaping process, when that blending was being done, more material was removed in some areas than others. Furthermore, when the board was removed previously, it looks like some damage happened and pieces have been inlaid on both sides near the heel. And these are, as you can see, kind of irregular, and the neck taper was affected. So what I've got to do is reconstruct that taper as best I can, plot straight lines that kind of average it out and allow me enough depth to do the blending thing, and still give the impression of like a straight-sided shape when viewed from the front. So I'm going to trace this out. You can see just how off this really is. I'll use a pen instead of pencil. So I can see areas where the neck sort of comes in and goes out and dips in and out. So I have to make sure that there's enough material on this side of the line to be absorbed by the binding, basically, so that I have some chance of evening it out. And this one is similar. That side's better. The side away from the player, as it always happens. So, yeah, there's going to be some blending to do, and if I use this as a measurement for the exterior of the board, I know I won't go too far wrong. Okay, so I got some white binding. This is supposed to be 1.5 millimeters thick, and they were just guessing when they said that, obviously. Close enough. It's 54 thousandths of an inch, which is small. It's thin, which is fine. I don't actually mind that. I might in another instance, but I can make this work. And frankly, a thinner binding on the neck generally looks more elegant. The question is there going to be enough width to absorb those bumps, dips, and deviations? I think we'll just get away with it. I'm using the shooting board and my junior jack plane to reduce the width of the board on both sides by the thickness of the binding. This requires planing and checking with a straight edge continuously. I'll begin the binding process at the end of the board. There are a couple of different ways to do this. Rather than miter the ends of the binding or cut them at a 45-degree angle, I'm going to butt joint them and have the side pieces run past and cover the end piece. In the long run, this seems to stay closed more often with the plastic binding, and it's easier to repair if those joints do open up. I'm also scuff sanding the glue surface with some 100 grit sandpaper, so there's a good texture for the aliphatic glue that I'll be using to put this together so it can grip. Traditionally, a solvent glue is used for this. We found that Tight Bond works just about as well and is less messy overall, and less toxic. The end grain needs a lot of glue as it absorbs a lot. I'll just tape that in place, making sure there's a slight overhang on both sides, which I'll scrape away later. When that's had a chance to cure, I can cut off the overhang on both sides in a series of passes. Don't want to force the chisel right through the middle of a piece of this binding. You want to kind of sneak up on it and then key off the side of the fingerboard so that it ends up in a good flush cut. The side pieces work the same way. Just work my way on down the board, applying a good amount of pressure with the tape. I'll cut those flush and lightly sand the corners. I'll use the card scraper to level the binding on the underside. I don't mind if the underside of the board is ever so slightly concave, as that will ensure that the edges will be tight where they meet the sides of the neck. The center will be pressed down by the clamps. And when I say slightly, I mean like 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, less than 0.1 millimeter. It's not wildly concave, it's ever so slightly concave. I've very carefully placed the board in position and aligned it and taped it in place. And here I'm drilling 1/16 of an inch, 1.5 millimeter holes through fret slots for a couple of indexing pins, which happen to be drill bits. This will keep the board from sliding out of position during the glue up. I somehow didn't manage to film the process of gluing in the carbon fiber strips, but they're just epoxied in place. Here I am applying fish glue, could be hide glue if you're really fast. Could also be epoxy, which in some ways might be best because it doesn't contain any water that might swell the neck, which could cause distortion as it dries. I'm not worried about this material. This is Spanish cedar. It's very dimensionally stable, and it's also got the carbon fiber in it, so I'm going to use the fish glue. It feels more traditional. The pins go in. I use multiple wraps of surgical tubing. That ought to hold it. Okay, so this is glued on, and you can see just how irregular things actually are when it comes to the edge. Just got away with it up here. There's enough that I can dress this out without running out of binding. But it is what it is. Currently this is about 6 millimeters, which is 235 thousandths of an inch, slightly less than a quarter of an inch. Now when I do this blending operation, I'm going to want to preserve the straight lines up at the top of the binding here. So what I'm going to do is darken the top edge a little bit, and that will help me keep track of just how far in I'm cutting and help preserve that straight line. I'm going to want to hold this in my vise while I do this delicate scrapey thing. So I'm just going to glue on a little block of wood to the fingerboard here with tape in between so that I can hold it comfortably. Some people asked about my Fretboard Summit experience, and it was very satisfying. Got to meet a number of viewers out there in the wild, and they were all great. It's nice to see you guys. The venue, which was the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago, you couldn't ask for a better place to stage a guitar symposium. Had a great time looking at guitars. I was allowed to play one of Ken Parker's newer archtops, which has kind of been sort of on the bucket list for me for a number of years. Good concerts, good lectures. My favorite memory is kind of not what I would have expected, actually. Bill Frisell was there. And I'm a big Bill Frisell fan, but he was involved in kind of a sort of funny thing. I'm really fascinated by him. I was talking with Mike Adams, the offset guitar king, Pusheen here on YouTube, and Duncan Price, who's a builder, just before the concert. And I think I said that Bill Frisell strikes me as someone who is kind of perpetually in a state of beginner's mind, in a Buddhist sort of way, you know? He knows all the theory, but at some point he moved so far beyond it that he's sort of back at the beginning again, which is really kind of a lovely place to be. He's constantly open and experiencing something anew, you know? And listening to him speak, he genuinely seems like a guy who really does his communication through music, primarily. He really struggles to string words together in a sentence if it's an interview. But it's an endearing thing. Anyway, Jason Verlinde, who is the publisher of Fretboard magazine, thought it was a good idea for Bill to direct a guitar orchestra. So Bill wrote out kind of a simple score, and there were about 60 guitars in the hall, all different types of guitars, different players, different levels of experience, different genres. And he basically took them from a fairly simple chord sequence and melody line, and then everyone just sort of started playing together. And at the beginning you could really tell there were folks who they really wanted to be heard and extemporize, not entirely happy with just playing what was on the page. And then there were those who kind of fell into a supportive role. And eventually, over the course of about half an hour or so, it gelled. And it gelled in the strangest way. It was organic. People lost some ego. Everyone tuned into the thing as a whole, you know. I wasn't playing, I was just there to listen. And there was this weird kind of magic. Like the whole place started ringing with overtones, and the beat was a little bit fluid, of course, because you couldn't get everyone to start like exactly at the right time. But that became a plus somehow. It was like the sound of waves breaking gently, this sort of swell. A really organic rise and fall, like a blossoming of each note. It was, and I'm using this word carefully, it was mystical in nature. And of course Bill's up there smiling at this thing that he sort of had nominal control over. But somehow it just made perfect sense as a metaphor for music as a unifying force. That's one thing I'm really going to remember. I'm going to get into the whole reset part of this operation. It's important to remember that this neck is not in its final configuration. It's a flat fingerboard. You can put a radius on a board before or after it gets installed on the guitar. In my case, I like to radius it after, when it's installed, especially in a case like this where there's no truss rod, because that lets me get the guitar to settle in, even put some string tension on it for a while, and then do the dressing so that things are going to remain flat with strings on, or maybe even dress in a small amount of relief into the board if I figure it's required. In this case, I've got little offcuts of fret wire on the 1st and the 12th position, and that just gives me a better read when I use the straight edge of where the plane of the frets are going to end up in relationship with the bridge when I'm actually tipping the neck angle back. Yes, things will change slightly when I radius the neck, but not very much in the center of the board. That gets touched virtually not at all. So this is accurate enough. And in some cases, I might even want to plane an angle, basically tipping the neck angle in the fretboard itself, removing a little bit more on the nut end than at the body end. So kicking it up that way as well, in the case where a neck is really, it has to move a tremendous amount, and this might be one of those cases. So now I can do the neck reset like I normally do, sandpaper pulls, checking and making sure the center line of the neck lines up with the center line of the body, and that it doesn't pitch one way or the other too much. So yeah, I really do need to tip this neck a lot. There's not going to be very much heel left when I'm done. I've got to address this area around the heel where the purfling is loose from the back and below, and the back itself seems to be loose from the curved lining in there. This is such a wide purfling scheme that there's not a whole lot of support beneath this. So I'm basically going to end up saturating the area with glue. I'm going to use regular yellow woodworking glue for this because it tends to be a bit more forgiving in some ways. It's slightly more elastic when it's cured, and if this takes a bump, it's not immediately going to open up again, hopefully. This has been open for a long time, I bet, because I really can't force it closed. Well, kind of. So I pumped in some glue and saturated the surface, and also got some inside between the lining and the back. Cleaned up all of the squeeze out. Used a bit of tape to hold down the purfling strips, and clamped everything together with spool clamps. This is down around the foot. You can see that the individual strips of purfling have separated from each other, and there's a portion which is missing. This is incredibly delicate stuff because you realize each one of these little pieces is glued together with end grain against a veneer strip. So I should get some little pins and glue these up together against the inside wall of the channel. I don't know what I'm going to do about the missing piece. Replicating this would be very, very difficult. There's a feeling of trepidation every time you move this stuff, because it's got the consistency of a mummy's fist when you're trying to unwrap the fingers from around a sacred amulet. It's so desiccated that at a certain point it's just going to explode in a cloud of stale dust. Most of it's going to get in your mouth, at which point it's lost and you're never going to be able to put it back together. So I'm being as careful as I can. I'm going to paint some of the Titebond style adhesive in there, and I really do think this is the glue for this job. If they had it, they would have used it. In this case, this is one of the ones where I'm not going to try and fool with hide glue in this case. And I'll use these dressmaker's pins to cram the two pieces up against each other in the side wall. There's no other way to really clamp this stuff. I'll try and get as much of the squeeze out cleaned up as well. With that done, I can now go back and glue the side back to the end block, which was loose. This is one of those major structural things. That'll require a combination of the big, long, quick grip clamp and a bunch of spool clamps. Sometimes celluloid binding likes to shrink back from the side of the guitar, In this case, I'm not sure it was ever perfectly closed. It's still flush with the side, and there is an accumulation of what looks like burn-in lacquer stick in the gap down in there, some of which may have cracked and fallen out. There's not much I can do in this case. I could refill it. Brave guys trying to bend that width of purfling around the waist of a guitar like this. Okay, that's all stuffed back into place, leaving a channel that needs to be filled with something. You can also see hints of just how colorful this inlay was when it was installed. It's chromatically very exciting stuff. I glued up a little sandwich of black and white veneer, which is similar to what was there. It's not exact. To make it so would have involved resizing every single strip in that sandwich in a feat of labor that was really kind of beyond the cost of this job. To be honest, even this was beyond the cost, but you know, what are you going to do? I get to plane that down to an appropriate thickness or width. I also got to make this incredibly skinny black-white lamination, each of those lines being about 0.08 of an inch thick. Veneer technology for this kind of decoration back in the day was beyond belief. I was talking recently with some other makers and suppliers. Some of the stuff that was available back then, we don't even know how it was manufactured at all, let alone for a profit. I'm going to saw the loaf into tiny little slices, many of which I'll have to then resize with a chisel so they'll fit into the channel. Yeah, this sort of work is kind of fun. These are going in dry. I'll top glue them afterwards. I'll start off with some slightly thinned tight bond. When it's dry, I'll also saturate it with thin super glue. Then I'll trim it back. I'll finish the surface with some lightly tinted amber shellac. Yeah, I think that looks all right. So we'll leave it here for this week. Next week when I come back, we'll cut some pearl. We'll get this thing singing. Thanks for watching.